You are listening to the It's Logical podcast, Episode 1, Doomsday Cues. Welcome to our journey through the echoes of fear that have shaped the American political landscape. Today, we explore the phenomenon we will refer to as the Doomsday Cue, a powerful signal used by those in leadership, particularly politicians, to stoke fear and anxiety among the population in order to secure votes and steer public opinion. This tactic, sometimes blatant, sometimes subtle, has been woven into the fabric of American history since the earliest days of our republic. By tracing its roots, examining its evolution, and confronting its presence in our modern era, we can begin to understand how politicians and the media have harnessed the human instinct for self-preservation, often inflaming it to achieve their goals. We will also search for ways to sift genuine threats from exaggerated ones, so that we might navigate the present without succumbing to a sense of panic that can distort the truth and overshadow the real issues at stake. In this episode, we invite you to listen, reflect, and decide whether the drumbeat of impending doom is truly a warning worth heeding or merely a call to the voting booth. In the early years of the nation, tension and uncertainty were abundant. The United States was an experimental project that had only recently severed its colonial ties to Britain, and the question of whether it could endure was on everyone's mind. Political leaders emerged to shape the contours of this new republic, and they faced the challenge of uniting citizens who came from diverse backgrounds and held different philosophies on government. Fear became an immediate currency of influence. With national survival seemingly on a knife's edge, it was easy for public figures to warn of catastrophe if certain policies weren't enacted or certain candidates weren't elected. These early anxieties can be considered the ancestral form of the Doomsday Cue, where the specter of foreign invasion or internal sabotage loomed over the country. Leaders who effectively harnessed this fear found it could rally men to serve in the army, sway opinions about foreign alliances, and bolster or crush political factions. As the new century rolled in and the nation evolved, the Civil War brought a period of unprecedented turmoil. In the years leading to that conflict, fear of slave revolts and fear of federal overreach were brandished across editorial pages, campaign rallies, and public gatherings. One side warned that the very moral fabric of the nation would be torn apart if slavery were allowed to persist, while the other side insisted that a destructive war would be unleashed if the status quo were shaken. This was more than political theater. It was a moment when genuine existential threats pressed in on all sides. Yet within that very real danger lurked the seeds of manipulative fear-mongering. Politicians, newspapers, and influential voices discovered that stoking the terror of a bleak future could stir action, whether it was an act of secession or a push toward abolition. The swirl of doomsday rhetoric turned neighbor against neighbor, accelerating the march to war. Though the root of the fear had basis in an essential moral crisis, the intensification of ominous warnings helped ensure a deadly conflict. Moving forward through American history, we find the Doomsday Cue emerging whenever the nation is on the brink of crisis or transformation. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrialization and waves of immigration sparked anxiety. Politicians used the arrival of newcomers as a way to paint doomsday scenarios about jobs lost and cultural dilution, stirring anti-immigrant sentiment and influencing voting patterns. At the same time, union activism and the threat of radical labor movements were brandished in speeches to convince a worried public that society would crumble unless drastic measures were taken to curb what was seen as un-American ideas. Fear became a tool to shape legislation on citizenship, labor rights, and civil liberties. Despite the complicated economic and social realities at play, politicians found it easier to harness fear than to attempt the more laborious process of explaining or solving the issues underlying that fear. During the 20th century, nothing exemplified the Doomsday Cue as vividly as the era of the Red Scare. After World War I, an intense fear of communism began to permeate public consciousness. This fear surged again after World War II, when the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower that could challenge the United States in the global arena. The threat of nuclear destruction was not mere rhetoric, it was a terrifying possibility. Yet, once again, politicians leveraged this very real anxiety to influence public opinion in ways that extended beyond genuine concerns about national security. Senator Joseph McCarthy became a symbol of how fear could be wielded to destroy reputations and consolidate power. His accusations, bolstered by dark hints of hidden communist infiltration, led to a culture of suspicion where few dared to question his tactics. The fear of being labeled unpatriotic or soft on communism drove citizens to seek strong leadership, no matter how reckless the methods employed by that leadership might be. The vote, therefore, was often cast not just for a candidate, but for the seeming guarantee of safety from an ominous threat. Even after McCarthy's downfall, the doomsday rhetoric surrounding the Cold War persisted. The fear of nuclear annihilation gripped the entire population, but it also served as an effective way to justify massive defense spending, interventions abroad, and restrictions on civil liberties. The entire fabric of civic life was stained by the sense that if one voted the wrong way, the consequences could be apocalyptic. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement intensified, some politicians sounded alarms about social upheaval and the breakdown of traditional order. The message was often subtle, cloaked in code words and indirect references, yet the thrust remained the same. If you do not align yourself with our vision, your way of life might vanish in chaos. Once again, true concerns about violence, social unrest, and rapid cultural changes blended with the manipulative wave of doomsday language, painting the other as an existential threat to be confronted. The result was an environment where fear became a potent motivator in elections, influencing those who felt threatened by the pace of change. While many leaders sought unity, others discovered that pressing the panic button could bring political advantage. The Vietnam War and the subsequent anti-war movement showcased another deployment of fear to command loyalty. Politicians who embraced the conflict suggested that if the spread of communism was not halted in Southeast Asia, it would soon wash onto American shores. As the war dragged on, fear turned inward, with government figures warning that protesters and critics were undermining American strength and playing into the hands of the enemy. Fear served to confuse the debate and foster distrust of dissenting voices. The pattern was clear. Raise the stakes, evoke a scenario of impending disaster, and position yourself or your party as the only bulwark against that doom. From the 1980s into the 1990s, the language of fear found new targets. The war on drugs, accompanied by warnings of rampant crime and social decay, allowed politicians to propose tough-on-crime legislation with enthusiastic support. Again, there was truth in concerns about addiction and violence, but the rhetoric was amplified to such a degree that many nuanced social and economic factors were lost in the cacophony of dire predictions. Voters were told of an impending moral collapse, prompting them to support aggressive laws that drastically expanded incarceration rates, sometimes with little regard for the long-term consequences. This intensification of dread achieved short-term political goals, but left complicated social issues festering in its wake. In more recent memory, the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, ignited an extraordinary climate of fear across the nation. It was a heartbreaking moment that rattled the national psyche. In the immediate aftermath, leaders spoke of unity and resilience, but as the war on terror continued, some political figures discovered that the fear of another devastating attack could galvanize support for a wide range of policy moves, from increased military interventions to expanded surveillance. The drumbeat of doomsday warnings, cautioning that countless enemies lurked in the shadows, proved powerful. Voters, eager for safety, often responded with overwhelming acquiescence to leaders who promised strong, decisive actions. Over time, it became a familiar script, an imminent threat, a dire consequence if left unchecked, and a clarion call to stand firmly behind those who claimed they alone could steer the nation away from catastrophe. As we push into the modern era, technology and the rapid flow of information have allowed the doomsday queue to travel faster and reach further than ever before. political rhetoric has found fertile ground on social media platforms, cable news channels, and viral videos. The sense of urgency and catastrophe seems to escalate almost daily, whether in election seasons or during national debates on healthcare, immigration, or the economy. Politicians on all sides of the aisle have discovered that they can secure votes and maintain support by depicting opponents' policies as disastrous. Warnings of bankrupting the country, robbing citizens of their freedoms, or leaving the nation vulnerable to hidden enemies saturate news cycles. In many cases, these warnings are built upon kernels of genuine issues or disagreements about policy, but the emotional pitch is elevated to such a level that the electorate is often reacting out of fear rather than facts. Consider how certain media outlets focus on the most sensational or alarming interpretation of events. If the conversation is about climate change, we sometimes hear messages framed in a way that insists total planetary doom is a breath away, drowning out rational discourse on realistic solutions. If the issue is immigration, the language may center on invasions and cultural collapse. If the topic is healthcare, the conversation might revolve around bankrupt hospitals or government overreach that would signal the end of personal choice. These narratives, though based on some measure of genuine concern, are frequently amplified by images and sound bites designed to elicit visceral responses. Modern political strategists understand that human beings are profoundly influenced by fear. Once people believe they face an immediate existential threat, they become more likely to support forceful measures and vote for leaders who promise security, even if those promises go unchecked. Social media has a unique role in all of this. Algorithms tend to reward extreme and emotionally charged content, which means that the direst warnings about the future often receive the most visibility. Politicians, influencers, and commentators who skillfully paint alarmist pictures can see their messages spread like wildfire. In this environment, the doomsday cue can dominate an entire election cycle, overshadowing nuanced discussion of issues and leaving many voters with the impression that they must choose between various apocalyptic outcomes. This phenomenon has inflated partisan divides, as each side regards the other with suspicion and invests heavily in the idea that a looming catastrophe can only be prevented by total victory at the polls. As the urgency of modern life continues to intensify, we must learn to question the avalanche of warnings about impending collapse. The doomsday cue preys on our impulses. It capitalizes on the fact that when afraid, people often long for simple, decisive solutions. But the overuse and manipulation of this tactic can drown out meaningful dialogue. Every crisis, genuine or exaggerated, demands our careful examination rather than our uncritical surrender to fear. We must find ways to balance caution with clarity so we can separate genuine threats from those that are inflated or fabricated. As we approach the conclusion of this episode, it is important to consider how we, as individuals, can recognize and counter the doomsday cue. Whenever a politician or media figure issues a warning of cataclysm, we can begin by examining the source of that claim. Does the speaker have a proven record of reliability? Or do they have a history of making sensational statements that do not withstand scrutiny? Are they using data and evidence from multiple reputable sources, or are they relying on a single perspective that conveniently supports their narrative? By scrutinizing the messenger, we gain insight into whether their doomsday proclamations are meant to inform or to manipulate. Next, we can look for signs of nuance. Very few political or social issues are purely black and white, and true experts tend to acknowledge complexities and unknowns. If a dire scenario is accompanied by all-or-nothing language, painting a future that is either perfect if you comply or disastrous if you dissent, there is a good chance that you are hearing the doomsday cue. The real world is rarely so clear-cut. Reputable analyses often include caveats, discuss both best and worst-case outcomes, and provide a spectrum of possibilities rather than a single, monolithic depiction of looming catastrophe. We can also ask ourselves, does this warning encourage us to investigate further, or does it discourage debate and critical thinking? If a politician insists that time is too short for questions and that only one course of action can save us, that might be a red flag. Genuine leaders who face critical challenges will often invite scrutiny because they know that transparent dialogue reinforces the credibility of their call to action. Those who panic at questions or dismiss them as disloyal might be using fear to shut down dissent. Being alert to such signals can help us separate urgent warnings that deserve attention from manipulative ones. We must remember that the objective of so many doomsday messages, especially when they come from politicians seeking office, is to mobilize voter turnout. This can be important if the threat is real, but it can be manipulative when the threat is overstated or misrepresented. When we feel that strong emotional pull urging us to act immediately and without reflection, it can be valuable to pause and gather factual information. A second look at the evidence can reveal whether the scenario is as dire as it is portrayed. Sometimes it is, but far too often the scenario's severity has been exaggerated in order to capture our loyalty at the polls. Staying informed through a variety of news sources, examining different angles, and weighing opposing viewpoints are all crucial steps to guard against doomsday rhetoric. It is important not to avoid or dismiss the possibility that some warnings may be genuine. The line between caution and alarmism can be thin, and the stakes can be high. Yet, if we reflexively accept only the most frightening scenarios and discount the rest, we allow fear to overshadow balanced judgment. That sense of dread can persist long after the vote is cast or the legislation is passed, seeping into the collective mindset and shaping a culture in which fear becomes the norm rather than the exception. Above all, we must remind ourselves that strong, healthy debate can coexist with urgent action when circumstances truly demand it. A society grounded in open discourse does not need to rely on doomsday announcements for motivation. Empirical evidence, thoughtful policymaking, and genuine leadership can guide us through crises. The American experiment, after all, has survived war, social upheaval, and ideological clashes. It may be imperfect, but its resilience is rooted in the spirited exchange of ideas and the capacity of citizens to engage critically with their leaders. Fear has always been part of the human condition, and politicians will forever be tempted by its power. Our defense against manipulation lies not in denying that fear exists, but in learning how to judge whether it is justified and how to respond rather than simply react. When the next election season arrives and the next wave of dire warnings about the future floods your social media feeds, consider asking questions about the authenticity of the claims. Question whether the dire outcomes being presented are truly inevitable. Look for an underlying agenda that might profit from your alarm. Listen not just to those who share your worldview, but also to voices you might normally overlook. It may be uncomfortable, but hearing a range of perspectives can help you discern whether a claim is simply an echo chamber of doom or a legitimate clarion call. By arming ourselves with knowledge, context, and a willingness to verify information, we can defuse the manipulation that thrives on panic and outrage. We can become more than just consumers of information. We can become active participants in a democracy that values reasoned debate over rash decisions. The Doomsday Cue may be as old as humanity's oldest stories of vengeance from the gods or monsters lurking in the shadows. In our modern context, it appears in broadcast news segments, political ads, viral social media posts, and water cooler conversations. Its power rests in our innate drive to protect ourselves and our loved ones from harm. Yet fear, if left unchecked, can blind us to the very solutions we need. It can lead us to embrace extremes or tear down the very institutions that could protect us in times of real distress. Understanding the history of the Doomsday Cue in American politics reminds us that while some threats are real, others are inflated to influence our decisions. Identifying the pattern of hyped rhetoric can free us from a constant cycle of alarm and allow us to approach the political process with clear eyes. As we conclude this exploration of how fear-based politics has swayed the course of American history and remains a potent force in modern campaigns, we invite you to think critically about the messages you receive. Ask yourself who benefits when these messages flourish. Reflect on moments in your own life when alarmist warnings drove you to vote a certain way or support a particular policy. Consider if the reality lived up to the threats that were promised. While we cannot eliminate fear altogether, we can learn to recognize when it is being manipulated for political gain. That awareness can be enough to break the spell of the doomsday cue and help us remain engaged, thoughtful, and guided by the facts rather than by the drumbeat of impending doom. Thank you for joining us on this journey through American history, from the earliest formations of our republic through the tumultuous 20th century and into the digital age, where information and alarm travel at lightning speed. Our democracy thrives when its citizens take a moment to pause, evaluate, and decide for themselves whether the threat they are hearing is real or is simply the latest iteration of fear-based persuasion. In future episodes, we will continue to examine the currents that shape our collective decisions. But for now, keep your eyes and ears open for the doomsday cue. Recognizing it is the first step towards seeing beyond it, sorting out fact from fiction, and casting your vote from a place of knowledge rather than unease. Let us move forward together with an understanding of how fear can distort our choices and how we can reclaim the narrative with clarity, balance, and the resolve to see the truth that lies beneath the turmoil.